Hey guys, this is John, and welcome to another Climbing the Rating Ladder video. I'm playing Hyukin, rated 1812. They're from Norway. Let's get rolling here if they're available. If not, I'm going to stop this recording and fire up another one. Yeah, hope everyone's doing well. I really hope I get a game here because, and my opponent does play d4. Okay. So pawn d4, why don't we play something a little experimental here? Let's go g6 on move 1. Yeah, I'm feeling in a fianchetto-y mood today. I usually meet d4 with d5, which I would recommend as a baseline, by the way. If you're looking for a defense to play against d4 and you're truly unsure where to start, you can't go wrong with d4, d5. Queen's Gambit declined, Slav in response to Queen's Gambit. Those are good options. Okay, and I'm going to play bishop takes c3 check here. This is the Dzindzi-Indian Defense. I love this opening. Aside from my beloved Scandi, this is probably my second favorite opening in chess. And it's one where if white doesn't know how to react, this is already a little offbeat, bishop g5. If white doesn't know how to react, it's very easy for white to get a poor position and for black to take control. So let's see if I can demonstrate that here. The critical moves were e4 and h4, actually. h4 looking for h5, e4 a gambit, trying to open the position. So bishop g5, this pins here, threatens d6, but this doesn't interfere with my desired setup, which is going to start with queen a5, hitting this pawn. And I would expect my opponent to defend this pawn. I would expect them to play queen b3, or maybe queen c2, maybe bishop d2. It's possible white could try to sacrifice it, but I wouldn't really anticipate someone to play that way. So queen c2 played. Let's go d6 now. And generally, black is looking to develop as follows. Knight d7, knight f6, knight b6, bishop d7, castles queenside, queen a4, putting pressure on the c4 pawn, and many options from there. Knight e4 in some cases. The knight has a nice outpost in the center. But look for especially that queenside development, knight d7, knight b6, bishop d7, and that little queen nudge, queen a4, coming up and attacking the c4 pawn. So, interesting strategy by black. You give up that fianchettoed bishop, but you double the pawns, and these doubled pawns can be quite hard for white to offload. It's very tricky for white to exchange them. They tend to just be fixed there, and hence why the e4 and h4 lines are some of white's best, trying to look for counterplay elsewhere. So, okay, knight f3, and I think knight d7 is what I'll do. Just vaguely looking at white playing e4 still, but I take, and queen takes c3. There will be a mate threat on e7, but just eyeballing that, I think that's going to be very good for me. By the way, those of you noting the time control, including myself, reminding myself this is a 10+5 game. I'm looking in the tiny print in parentheses. I wish chess.com, I don't know why they don't put it front and center when you're watching or playing a game. It seems very easy to do that like Lee Chess does, but you got to look in the tiny print in the chat box basically to find out what time control it is. But this is a 10+5. Okay, h4 played now. Yeah, so I could consider h6, maybe a move I should have mentioned before, chasing the bishop. I didn't see a great reason to do it previously. Maybe now is a good time to play it, just to prevent white from exchanging. I do kind of like the look of that. Yeah, and I don't think g6 is going to be an issue. That doesn't seem loose enough, let's say, for it to be an issue yet. So let's play it. White backs up to f4, and now I'm thinking knight f6, which helps control h5. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good. Could also play this right away, but I don't see a real reason to. So yeah, let's go ahead and play knight g to f6. I feel very happy here. I think I already have a pretty good position. I don't think white has to panic yet, but white should think critically about how they're going to interfere with my coming play. Knight b6, queen a4, bishop d7, like I was saying, because especially when the queen a4 move hits, I've found, white can really start to flounder, not knowing whether to trade queens or whether to allow the c4 pawn to drop in a lot of cases. It may even be simply indefensible. And I'll talk a little bit about the Dzindzi-Indian afterwards too, if you're curious about this opening. I played it many other times on this channel. I can't recall a climbing the rating ladder game in which I played it, though. So this is a first. All right, so we got white thinking a little bit. I would maybe consider the move a4 roundabout here. At least after knight b6, maybe playing a4, because again, if black gets to nudge that queen up there, almost all these queenless middle games are good for black if the queens get swapped, because these pawns are such a liability, and the bishop pair just doesn't really play very much for white. It's hard for white to meaningfully engage that pair of bishops. So a4, even if white were to later lose that pawn, it might be worth it just to try to open some lines, maybe put me in a pin if I ever dare to take on the a file. I think e3 would be an expected move here, maybe with knight d2 to come or bishop d3. But I can consider knight e4 on the next move if I want. I'd say my main candidates are going to be knight e4 and knight b6, swinging around, applying pressure to these doubled pawns. I kind of mentioned this already, but the fact that it's hard for white to get rid of these pawns due to the block structure here with the d pawns having this like ram type structure, d5, d6, and no other tension to speak of, that sort of distinguishes these doubled pawns compared to like a Nimzo-Indian, for instance, where in a Nimzo-Indian, even if white takes on those doubled pawns, bishop b4 takes c3, there are a lot of lines where white stands a good chance of actually being able to trade for them. Okay, e3 played after prolonged thought. That was a 2+ minute think for white. So feeling good here. Yeah, just debating if I want to throw this in or if I want to start with this move. Although this wins a tempo in compelling white to defend the c3 pawn, let's say rook c1, after knight b6, bishop d3, I don't like that white is double threatening there. Although in fairness, yeah, there are some cases where if white double captures, they run into bishop f5 with the queen actually being trapped. I don't know if that's compelling enough for me to deviate from knight b6, though. I don't want to spend too much time. Brief calculation here. Knight e4, rook c1, knight b6, bishop d3. Let's say queen a4 at that point. Yeah, bishop takes e4, take. I do like the look of that. Maybe knight e4, rook c1, knight b6. There's something like g4, though. All right, let's play knight e4. I want to try to maintain this time edge. That was 1:20 for me. Yeah, let's go here now, as planned. Yeah, I'm not quite convinced by this. I can actually just take, now that I think about it, because queen takes still runs into this bishop f5 idea. Okay, knight d2 played. White's looking for the swap, fair. That is understandable, but again, maybe queen a4? But then take, we trade, and white has knight takes d6 in between move. Okay, so probably not going to do that. Should I simply swap? I think I will. Knight takes d2. Expecting queen takes. And already queen a4 looking uncomfortable for white with the c4 pawn. How to defend it. Is white really going to go queen d3, queen e2 in that situation? I wouldn't want to. I do have to be somewhat careful on the dark squares. No doubt. Now let's play this move now. Because white has a dark square bishop, and I do not. This is an unopposed bishop for the moment. But I like the fact that I have some presence on the dark squares with the pawns. If h5, I can go g5, increase that dark square presence. Do not shy away from putting your pawns on the same color as your opponent's unopposed bishop. Right? So if your opponent has a bishop that you do not own, do not try to put all your pawns opposite that bishop or assume more broadly that that is the correct strategy. A lot of people think that way. They think, oh, I need to safeguard these pawns. If my opponent has a dark square bishop, I'm going to put them on light squares. No. If you want to actually play ambitiously and try to push back against that color complex, you need to have pawns against your opponent's bishop to restrict it. Okay, queen e2. So yeah, kind of an ugly move. This is going to hamper white's development. Probably just bishop d7 here. I could maybe consider e5, but it's not quite ready yet, I think. I don't know if I want to open the position yet. e5 is a motif in these positions, but I can delay it. I actually wonder if white's going to go for e4. That's my read. I think white's going to try to play for this. Bishop d7, e4. Interesting. Bishop d7, e4. I mean, I could castle, but then e5. I'm getting kind of cramped. But I have knight takes d5 there. Bishop d7, e4 castles. Yeah, and black often castles this way, even with the half-open b file, because black's king is extremely safe. So here, e5, knight takes d5, hit the bishop. I like that a lot. I think that could open up really nicely in my favor. Let's play this. Still trying to maintain some time edge. It's not as large as perhaps it was a few moves ago, like 5 moves ago, when my opponent had that 2-minute think. But it's still a time edge. Thanks, everyone, for your well wishes, by the way. I've mentioned I've been dealing with this voice issue, this muscle tension dysphonia disorder that I have. I've been doing vocal exercises for it. I'm working with a speech-language pathologist. That's been really helpful, even though I'm kind of just starting that. And yeah, I feel really good about it. I do think I'll be able to get back to a point where I'm able to speak at length without discomfort. So keeping these videos, this is actually why I haven't been doing standard videos lately. Keeping them to about a half hour seems to be right for me. And we can still pack a lot of instructional stuff into these videos. But the standard videos, when it goes to an hour or more, I think that's starting to put a significant strain on my voice in my current state. So, okay, queen c2. Yeah, so white's really bopping that queen around. That's 3 consecutive queen moves. And I'm not opposed to a trade of queens. So I'm just thinking if I want to allow white to initiate it or if I should initiate it myself. I'm thinking I might trade and then castle queenside and look for this e5 move. Either that or allow white to take, but the knight coming in, it's not exactly like I'm threatening this. Yeah, this doesn't seem like a hugely important decision to me. Let's just make the capture. I'll keep the bishop here just so if e5, I can take en passant. Yeah, definitely castle this way. If I were to castle this way, I'd lose this pawn. And again, not at all uncommon for black to castle queenside in the Dzindzi-Indian. This knight on b6 and the lack of a pawn break by white makes it hard for white to attack over there, even with queens on board. All right, bishop e2. So I'm thinking about e5. That's a pretty appealing move. Only thing is, so en passant and then rook to d2. How do I feel about that? Because that does attack d6. Maybe I simply play king c7 at that point. I kind of slow play it. Yeah, that should be good. If we can ever get a situation where my knight lands on c4, I think I'm going to play this. It's also g5 in some cases. Take, trade rooks, take. Not sure I'm quite feeling g5 yet, though. Yeah, let's go e5. So is Anarchy Chess going to prove accurate here? And my opponent take en passant? Because we know, according to Anarchy Chess, en passant is forced, right? Shout out to Anarchy Chess on Reddit. But I have this sneaking suspicion white might not do it because they haven't played it yet. They see what I'm up to, looking to pressure c4 in expedient fashion. I mean, if white takes en passant, it really makes these pawns certifiably ugly. Double isolated. They can't even claim to have this d pawn as a counterpart pawn. So I've certainly been wrong on my reads before, but I predict white's going to move this bishop. Bishop g3. Maybe h2, but yeah, one of these two moves. But then maybe I start advancing g5. Remember I was saying pawns on dark squares? This dark square bishop for white, the unopposed bishop, starts to look quite restricted. Okay, John's read is wrong. You win, Anarchy Chess. But I'm pretty happy about this take. I think white has to go rook d2 here to have any chance. It sounds dramatic, but I think if white loses c4, and especially if the light square bishops come off, like let's say castles, bishop takes c4, all right, we might see this. Yeah, I'm very happy to get this exchange in and whittle it down to knight versus bishop with a beautifully posted knight on c4, helping guard d6. I've got a 4 versus 2 majority from the A file through the D file. So, yeah, I think now start bringing up the king. King c7, king c6. We're in the endgame at this stage, so we can be a little more bold with our king, start coordinating. Do I care about throwing in b5? I kind of feel like this is a better move to begin with. I really like to overprotect in consolidating situations, so if you're up a little bit in material, starting to consolidate. Okay, rook d5, that looks superficial. It threatens this because of the pin, but I'm going king c6. And white cannot play rook d2. So that rook's just going to have to go back. Yeah, I think white definitely lost the thread a few moves ago. But the position was looking uncomfortable. I definitely like my game after e5. Okay, rook d1 played. So maybe b5. It might be time for the b5 move. Long term, it's a little annoying that I have to stay guarding this h6 pawn, so I could attempt to try to solve that issue. But I'm not seeing an obvious way to do that. This move looks definitely useful, so we don't have to have a grand plan in mind here. That's a big myth in chess in general, but especially in endgames, you often hear it, like you have to have some sort of long-winded plan to win the game. That might be appropriate in some cases if you can actually predict what your opponent's going to do with a high degree of accuracy, but most of the time your plans are going to be short range, 2 to 4 moves, and a lot of adjusting based on what your opponent's doing. Okay, I saw this move. I thought I could take, and then if the rook comes over, play knight b6 and defend. So I think I'm going to do that. It is a pawn. Maybe white can play c4 at some point. Okay, this is interesting. So white played this one. This might not be a threat because of knight b2 now. But then again, it could be because... yeah, I guess it is a threat, technically. Oh, I also have a3. I'm just noticing I have a3. That didn't register when I took here. Didn't register in my head. So a3 looks pretty easy, actually. a3 and then swing a rook over. Why overcomplicate this? Yeah, because really the only way white can dislodge this knight is if they get their king involved, and that is such a slow plan. It may not even work for tactical reasons. I can also prop up the knight with d5. Oh, this is nice. Chess.com puts a little info here. En passant is a special pawn move by which a pawn captures another pawn that has advanced 2 squares. Can confirm. Can confirm. All right, so I think next I may be looking for rook b8, rook b2. Possibly this d5 move. I don't know. I think the last obstacle is this bishop, just deciding how to navigate around that bishop. It's possible I could get this rook involved, maybe rook h7, rook b7, rook b2, and not even worry about the h-pawn much. That pawn doesn't seem of great value. Even if I were to lose it for free, I'm still up a pawn, and white has no good way of breaking through over here yet. But in the spirit of the comment I made a moment ago, I'm not trying to look too far ahead here because, yeah, I mean, I couldn't predict that white's going to play e4. So this just looks like a desperate move. I don't really even see the point of it. I'm just going to take. I guess white's trying bishop c1. Okay, fair. Yeah, they really want to eliminate this pawn, but I got this pawn too, and that bishop is going to be pretty poorly placed after that. But let's think. Rook b8 now? Rook b8, bishop takes a3, rook b3 maybe, or a5. a5 looks pretty good. Yeah, let's start with this. I probably should have realized that that was the point. I was a little dismissive of e4, but I'm not super attached to the a-pawn. So I feel this should be only a minor... whoops. Did not mean to play that. I meant to play a5. Whoops. That's where chess karma can get you. I'm just talking about how it's like a minor thing. Like, I'm probably just going to win easy. And I mouse slipped a6. Fortunately, I don't think, knock on wood, I'm literally knocking on my wooden desk here. I don't think that's going to be consequential. Let's now play a5. That could have been bad, folks. Yeah, I'd really like to go here. If I had played a5, then bishop c1, I was going to bring my rook into b1 and pin white. So this should be a little harder now, but still looks winning. If rook a4, I can play d5, connect everything. Yeah, probably rook b3 coming in. Okay, king f1. So I get a redo here. I get a chance to play this if I want. This king, even if it comes in here, it's kind of restricted anyways. But what is my follow-up after rook b1? There may not be an obvious follow-up move against that. How about I play this first? Yeah, let's go rook b3 first, just to remind white that this pawn is weak. Try to induce rook c2, and then my a-pawn has more of an open lane to work with. That might be the way to go. If I want to solve this issue, by the way, I can always play h5. I probably should have mentioned that as an option. Okay, bishop d2, awfully passive move to defend the pawn. Okay, taking here makes sense. I would have 3 connected pawns, but I don't even really want to lose the a-pawn. So I'm thinking maybe get behind here. If bishop takes h6, I take c3. I think king b5 could make some sense too in this position. Looking for a4. H5 makes sense. You know what? I think I'm going to play the h5 move. I have everything secure right now, so let's go ahead and do that. Stop g4. Yeah, it does put a pawn on a light square, but I think this bishop's already so passive, and the position has opened up enough that trying to restrict that bishop is not a huge priority for me anymore. Rook b2 is another move, by the way, if I wanted to try to force a trade of rooks. Okay, bishop g5 played. So if I take, I think white's point is here, clever, which is a fork on the 2 rooks. Yeah. Okay, but maybe now I get behind here and I play rook a8. Just looking at any way white could play to take down these points, because that's about the only thing I would be concerned with at this stage. I mean, maybe rook e2 is something of note here. If white gets to do this. I'm actually going to go rook e8. Let's defend this pawn. I could see some cases where I might want to push. Okay, king e2. So giving me this pawn now, I think conclusively I can take it at this point. I don't see anything wrong with that. Let's do it. Maybe bishop d2 will be played. But I can even play rook d3 against that. Bishop takes a5, trade, rook a8 with the pin. It looks fatal for white. Bishop d2 played. I like the look of this move a lot. Not yet agreeing to the swap. Just double checking my calculations after this. But this should be pretty easily winning because this is not on a dark square. So They can't hold. And if white doesn't take here, at minimum, I can trade down on d2 on the next move. And that's going to be too much material. Yeah, so make that trade. Rook a8 with the pin. And white may resign here. Nothing to do. Rook e2 if you're going to continue. Try to pick up that pawn, but definitely enough material. Rook c2 played, and we'll take with the knight. Maybe white will hop back here trying to pin, but nope, they resign. All right. Yeah, thanks to my opponent for the game. Oh, they said GG, big fan. Hey, thank you, Hukin, for the game. I'll just mention to them, this is for climbing the rating ladder. Will post today. Thanks again. And definitely, if someone wants to comment on this game, if you ever happen to get a game with me, I love to hear from opponents. It's highly educational. So I'm just going to mention that to them as well. All right, so yes, the Dzindzi-Indian, also known as the Beefeater. I think chess.com labels it the Beefeater. But more commonly, I've heard it referred to as the Dzindzi-Indian, named after Roman Dzindzi-Hashvili, one of the pioneers of this system. So, yeah, I feel this bishop g5 approach wasn't great for white, and I do think white has to be careful thereafter. I want to say somewhere around here, it's already starting to look bad for white with the defense of the c4 pawn. My opponent said, I will be scathing. Scathing in their own critique, I imagine. You know, you didn't play all that bad, Hukin. As I said, this is just a tough system to fight against if you haven't played against it before or can't remember the line. So it's a quirky setup. Black going through the effort of fianchettoing within the first couple moves, but then immediately exchanging the bishop for the knight thereafter, after the c5 move, trying to induce d5. And then f5, black looking to control e4. So just a few general thoughts on this. So you can only employ this setup specifically against the move order that we saw in this game. So if you're black and you like what you just saw, I have bad news for you. You can't play this as a default setup against d4. It requires cooperation from white. So g6, and then c4 is pretty common for queen's pawn players. But white could also play e4, right? If white wants to take it into like a Pirt's modern or modern defense, then you have to be ready for that. And then they could play knight f3. They could withhold moving the c pawn. Knight c3. This is a totally different type of system. Again, we might get into a Pirt's modern. You could go into a Gurganidze, which is c6 followed by d5. I played that on the channel before too. And also, speaking of ways white can deviate, so after c4, bishop g7, a lot of players do not play knight c3 in this position. They play knight f3, they play e4. There's some definite King's Indian crossover here. So I played like d6 and sometimes even transposed into a King's Indian out of this. If you want to try to keep it offbeat, you can think about stuff like knight c6, or after d6, even going e5, or possibly knight c6 here, and then try to get the knight into the center. This knight f3 move, I think, is pretty good and also annoying for white, because now if black goes c5, d5, there's no knight to capture here. I've tried to play this where you actually delay playing knight f6 in hopes that white goes knight c3 in the near future, so you can duck back into a Dzindzi-Indian. But a savvy player here is white. Like if you go look at one of my recent using the clock as a weapon videos, I think I had this position against Grandmaster Alexander Rustemov, and he played g3. And I tried to play some kind of waiting moves, something along these lines, but he just refrained from playing his knight to c3 for a long time, like until I did this and castled, whereupon there's no question that some bishop takes c3 thing is going to be impossible for black. So yeah, I like this setup a lot. I'm not going to claim this is the soundest opening for black. The engine does give a pretty large advantage to white, just starting from this position. But it's a lot of fun to play. I think it has a high degree of success against the unprepared player. So especially suitable for blitz, some rapid chess, maybe even classical if you're well prepared in this for black. And it's a surprise weapon especially. But you got to know your stuff and you can't force it. Okay, it's not a universal defense against d4. But you do get this position a fair amount. And upon c5, I have some opponents who play knight f3. I actually played a casual over-the-board game the other day where my opponent played knight f3. But I think after takes and then knight c6, black's already doing fine. White doesn't quite have like a full Maroczy bind setup because they haven't got into e4. So I'm very, very satisfied with this position as black. I've actually often played it like this, where you go knight h6 and you try to navigate this knight to f5 at some stage. Actually, the game I had the other day went exactly like this. And I think I played e5 here, but I was already in pretty good shape. So yeah, as played, white plays this d5 move, definitely principled, definitely correct as well. If white takes on c5, by the way, number of ways you can play it. You could still go for this and truly wreck white's structure. White would have to prove that they have some sort of compensation for these wrecked pawns. You could also play knight a6 if you want to try to recover the pawn this way. So d takes c5 is not considered a critical try. So d5, and here we go, bishop takes c3. These next two moves really characterize the Dzindzi-Indian, giving the bishop, the fianchetto bishop, but more or less permanently doubling these pawns for white. And then this f5 move. Crucial move so you don't get completely squeezed in the center. So white can't go e4, establish a large space advantage like in a Benoni or something. This would be a really bad Benoni for black if you played something like d6 and allowed e4. I don't think this is enough counterplay for black. You'd have to be careful on the dark squares here. But f5 is kind of nice because it does look to clamp e4, and you get this characteristic, interesting pawn structure. Okay, so let me turn off the engine for a second. Actually, we can click into the game review now. I think after f5, the next move that white played, that bishop g5 move, is already, kind of suspect. It's a bit of a shot in the dark bishop move. Yes, it does have d6 in mind, but it doesn't interfere with this plan. Let's look at the book for a second. Yeah, so if you guys get this from the white side, you have no excuse. h4 and e4, two top moves for white. Look at e4 in particular, scores pretty well. h4, interestingly, black actually scores better than white. You see that a lot in this opening. This is one of these lines, guys, where the engine will say that white is substantially better, but in practice, black is scoring better. And it's not even because of like traps. It's not like a Stafford Gambit or something where we can obviously discern why that's the case. There's tons of traps that one side has to avoid. This is more of like a strategic opening for black, which is probably why it appeals to me, where if white doesn't understand that they need to open the position quickly, that's where black really starts to get a grip on the proceedings, and white can just suffer with these weak pawns and get outmaneuvered, losing a lot of endgames. Kind of like you saw in this game. That's pretty par for the course for a lot of my Dzindzi-Indian games, to be honest. So it's imperative that white try to do something like this, h4. And if queen a5, I think white's going to go h5 actually in this position. Yeah, they can play h5 or bishop d2 if you want to defend. But even something like this, the engine actually approves of setups like this a lot, just giving a pawn in the hopes of opening the position. This is kind of funny, black fianchettoing the queen. But I think white would much rather just philosophically play a position like this versus the one they got in the game where they had to tend to these pawns for many moves, and it was pretty uncomfortable. So yeah, h4. And there's all sorts of interesting lines like knight f6, yeah, h5. And if black captures here, white can, I think, take right away and then play e4, going for queen takes h5. Or they can play e4 right away. Yeah, because if take here, black is going to meet a swift demise in a line like this, right? Check. King's getting embarrassed here. Check. at minimum, something like that. Take the rook. Black is not long for this world. So, yeah, interesting setups possible. Rook g8. I remember this line where black doesn't react to h4, h5, just lets white take. You get this trade. Queen a4, also interesting move if white wants to try to beat black to the punch here and actually stop queen a5. I've encountered this a few times. Queen b6. White has this h-file, which is sort of vacant. Interesting little offer of a queen trade here in this line. And then e4, kind of similar. So e4, f takes e4, almost always played, and then f3, white offering a gambit. Black usually not taking the gambit. I should probably shrink my camera as usual so you guys can see the breakdown here. Yeah, so e4, f takes e4, f3. Because I think if you take knight takes, white's compensation here is already pretty substantial. Oh, sorry about that. My analysis went haywire. e4, take, f3, take, knight takes f3. Engine already registering about a +1 advantage for white. White's going to have a lot of play down the E and F files, this open file situation in the center. Yeah, just looking at some of the moves it's suggesting. Bishop d3, castles. This bishop's going to come out somewhere. You could just envision rooks coming to f1, e1. The play is going to gravitate more towards the middle of the board versus black getting this clamp and play down the sides. So e4 takes, f3. I think black usually plays d6 or knight f6 here, if I remember. Actually, no. e5, queen a5. Okay, I got to look at these lines again. At least those are the most popular. I don't know what the engine suggests. Yeah, d6, knight f6. It's interesting that black often goes ahead and plays queen a5 anyways in that position. Yeah, so we won't do a deep dive here. Also, in the interest of trying to save my voice a little bit, I will talk more about this opening. I'd actually like to write something about this opening or maybe do a video series on it because I find it fascinating. So let me know if you guys are interested in that. Would be good for me, too, to brush up on some of these lines. But e4, h4, critical stuff. And I think if white goes for one of those approaches, you kind of see black trying to batten down the hatches, as we saw with knight f6 and rook g8 against h4, h5. Also in a case like this, like e5, let's say. Point there is if takes, there's queen h4. Let's say d6. I think a lot of times black will attempt to keep things kind of closed. Yeah, knight bd7. Sometimes they plop the knight here, try to block up the middle of the board. In fact, I think I've even seen games like this, where black accepts the double isolated pawns to attempt to keep it closed. But also stuff like this, try to plop a knight on e5, suppress the bishop pair for white. But no doubt white is better in these positions. Tricky to play. Okay, so as played, bishop g5 instead. Bishop g5. I went ahead and played queen a5. Yeah, h6 probably also worth considering. Just wasn't sure if I wanted to commit to that yet, so I didn't play it. I thought white would probably back off to f4 if I did. So queen a5, queen c2, d6. Yeah, and let's see where the engine thinks white can improve here, because white played an aggressive move. I mean, h4, maybe not the best. Wants white to go e3 instead. It's not a huge difference in the eval. Something like this. Yeah, queen a4. See, I personally would take black in these positions already, but the engine's not too bothered. It's not indicating that this is anything dire for white. Let's just see roughly how it wants to play it. Castle's kingside. Let's say h6, yeah. Bishop f4, g5. I guess I have to watch bishop takes f5 in some cases. There's some counter pressure here. Again, on site, I would take black here for sure. But the computer's not too impressed. Bishop c2. Hit the queen. Take here. It's a game. It's a game. So h4. And I do kick the bishop. Play my knight out. E3. Interesting. B5. Okay, B5 was not a move on my radar. I very rarely would think about this move this early, especially with how common knight B6 is. But yeah, interesting. So B5 trying to take and then take D5. Attack C3 and the bishop. Okay, worth keeping in mind. I was debating between knight B6, knight E4. It did seem to me like this was pretty worthwhile to hit this pawn. So I went for that. And then here, yeah, and I was expecting bishop D3 at this point. I was going to play queen A4 here because I mentioned if takes, we're not going to take the queen. That would be terrible because white takes with their bishop. But instead, we're going to play on bishop takes E4, simply the recapture, hoping for queen takes E4 because then bishop F5 traps this queen in the center of the board. That's a common trick in this line. And if something like knight D2, well, I think taking, maybe defend this pawn a little bit, and the knights are sort of at a standoff here. Black does look a little bit better, but not going to be easy to prove it, probably. But yeah, I definitely like black's pawn structure. These pawns, to me, look weaker than this one, which has kind of a cramping effect. Still might go for E5 later, maybe. So that was my intention there. But white went knight D2. Yeah, we traded. I crept forward with queen A4. Okay, now here, the advantage is ticking ever so slightly into black's territory. And you can see F3, bishop D3, rook D1. All these lines are suggesting that white not try to hold on to the C pawn, the C4 pawn, which is quite interesting, right? So if here take, yeah, it wants white to simply play this position down a pawn. Maybe look to play E4 at some point. That makes a lot of sense. To me, that's similar to when I was briefly showing the queen A5, queen takes C3, and then bringing the queen back here type of line. Probably not a bad deal for white, given how long-term weak those pawns are, to try to just give one up in hopes of coordinating and using the fact that black has captured one of those pawns potentially to white's advantage to try to further open the position somehow. Again, black's up a pawn here. I'd probably still take black. Engine says equal. It is opposite color bishops, but I would assume white's going to try to get in E4 at some stage. That's a tough call to make, though. I mean, I think a lot of human players are just going to want to defend C4, as my opponent did. But yeah, queen E2, definitely an awkward move. I'd be curious why white didn't play bishop D3 if they're going to use their queen to defend, because at least then you can go here. Interestingly, though, that appears worse, according to the engine. Probably because of the same plan. Yeah, I can imagine if something similar went down like this, this is still going to be pretty bad for white. But okay, queen E2, bishop D7. We got this quintessential Dzindzi-Indian arrangement here, looking for castles kingside, or queenside, rather. Now white changed their mind with queen C2. So I was thinking if white went E4 here, of castling, not fearing takes, because queen takes E7 is definitely unplayable. We get to pin white in the center of the board here, win the queen. So I was thinking they might go E5 instead, but then I have this knight takes D5 move, and look at the queen showing her usefulness on the A4 square, ready to swing laterally to pick up the bishop and even hit the rook in addition to the pawn here. Kind of surprised this is only minus 1.38. This looks crushing, but... So that's what I thought might happen, E4. Instead, white went queen C2. I did debate a little bit whether to initiate the trade or let white initiate, but ultimately I decided to initiate because I wanted to keep my bishop here and go for this E5 plan as quickly as possible. Yeah. So it's suggesting kind of some bizarre moves here. Rook H3. That's a tough move. Looking to come over here and attack. Maybe in a longer game, that's something white would think of. That wasn't on my radar either, though. I got to admit. Rook D2 might be interesting. Yeah, trying to slow me down. So if this take, white can take here at the end. Kind of like Rook D2. I do think that's sort of a human type move. Now it says G5. Interesting. So if take, trade the rooks. It wants me to think about sacking a pawn and maybe 2 pawns, even giving this one, because I guess knight takes c4 is already really good for black. Probably bishop b5 coming in. That bishop ain't feeling too good on f1. Pin to the king on e1. Yeah, this is a stab I've used before too, this g5 move. Again, pawns against the opponent's bishop, the unopposed bishop. Instead, bishop e2, e5. Take. Still holding at just a small disadvantage, quarter pawn to a half pawn, but it doesn't feel that way. Like in practice, these positions feel like more than that to me. I mean, rook g1, come on. Raise your hand in the comments if you would play rook g1 here. That's how you get flagged for being stockfish. Rook g1, I guess, trying to get in g4 at some point. Other moves are rook h3 and rook b2. Rook b2 also kind of a hard to appreciate move. I guess the idea there is like if takes, maybe you take on b6 and you remove the defender. But it does allow this one at minimum. Yeah, I mean, I think for all intents and purposes, this is not a situation White's going to hold too often. Even though it's only minus 0.2. You got to find rook g1 to keep the advantage at 2/10 of a pawn. Disadvantage at 2/10 of a pawn. Not happening. So if White played rook d2, I'm just trying to remember my calculation here. Yeah, I think it was king c7, because initially I was thinking take, but then I mentioned how, oh, we can actually just take our time and defend this pawn, because this pawn is not going anywhere. And again, it wants to play rook g1. But if White were to castle, take, and just the timing doesn't work for White, much like the game, right? Because if here we can take, White might take here, but king c6, and they're going to lose material. So they have to pause to do this, and this looks a lot like the game. Knight c4, sink the knight in, or king c6, and then knight c4, or d5 maybe. White's not going to win the d6 pawn. So, okay, all that said, White castled. We got to take. I was very happy to trade these light score bishops. I don't have to fight against the bishop pair. Yep, king c7. If that move seems mysterious to you, then it might be worth watching some of my endgame videos. Games where I trade queens early on. You kind of start to develop this feel for the king as you get better and better, where you understand that it can be used as a fighting piece in even like technical situations in the endgame. Like the king as a fighting piece is sort of a known endgame rule, but I'm more so doing this to help coordinate my position, to help defend d6 and push the pawns forward, allow the rooks more scope on the back rank. So a little bit mysterious, I admit, but we're not at all afraid of our king safety. Even later when my king got to c6 and maybe was thinking about coming up here, king's perfectly safe. Yeah, rook d5, that was a superficial move by White, threatening this, but I'm not going to fall for that. It's tough for White. I mean, I guess I would maybe think about trying to get their majority over here going. That's the only thing White can point to, this 4 versus the 3, where they might have some edge. But I don't know. I feel like if you push e4, it might just create more problems, as it can be an isolated pawn. I think White kind of has to sit here and hope for the best. I mean, yeah, maybe king f1, start bringing the king over. Maybe a4, although the pawn could easily be weaker on a4. I think this position's technically losing for White, but maybe there's some chances of resistance. Okay, I went b5. Rook dg8 is an interesting engine suggestion, looking to go g5. Yeah, because I was trying to figure out how to resolve this situation to free up my h8 rook. Could play h5, but then I do give the g5 square to White. Okay, b5 seems pretty consistent. Yeah, White surprised me with this move, and I didn't see initially I could play a3, which I probably would have also done against rook a1 if I had thought about it. So rook a2, a3, e4. Yeah, and again, I was a little careless here. I was sort of like White's getting desperate, but yeah, this is their idea, trying to win the a pawn. And the next move was just a mouse slip. Or, sorry, the move coming up. Yeah, I played rook b8, and on bishop takes a3, I was trying to play a5. or set the pawn back down and then play a5. Sometimes I do that. Like I'll pick the pawn up and set it back down on the wrong square. But yeah, I meant to do this. And then if bishop c1, I was going to play probably rook b1, maybe rook b3. And as it happened, it didn't affect things, fortunately for me. Still a -2 edge here. But that could have been costly, needless to say, anytime you mouse slip in chess. Yep, a5, just keeping everything together. Like, notice how compact everything is. Notice the strength of the knight on c4. Tough for white to attack. The pawn on c3, knights do a great job blockading enemy pawns. White has a hard time getting at that knight because they can't play rook c1 ever. Yep, h5. We could maybe somewhat critique some of these moves, but I think it's pretty much all roads lead to Rome territory here. Took this pawn. Yeah, rook d3 felt like a nice way to play this. And I would have just taken on d2 next, more than likely, if given the chance. But white took here. Trade down, rook a8, and winning more material. Okay, so thanks again to Hukin for the game. Sounds like they're a viewer, so I really look forward to seeing your comments. Hukin, if you're watching this. And just tough for white if they don't have a game plan from the jump against this particular opening. And again, what kind of distinguishes this opening from a lot of other offbeat openings is that this is not necessarily a trappy opening for black. It's a strategic attempt to control the board, clamp the center, close off the bishops, and put long-term pressure, especially against these c-pawns, via that setup I showed you with knight f6, d6, knight bd7 to b6, bishop d7, castles queenside, queen a4, the classic queen a4 nudge, maybe e5 later to get the e-pawn going as well. And I think this was a fairly textbook Dzindzi-Indian game. You can probably tell I enjoyed myself in this game because it feels nice to win in this way. But from the white side, hopefully we learned that e4 and h4 are the moves to look at here. And broadly, you want to try to open the position against this opening, because if you wait too long, you might not have that luxury. So better to open the position even at the cost of some potentially unclear play, because if it gets opened up, that's where the bishops could really shine. Also, just a reminder, you can't force the Dzindzi-Indian. It requires this move order and this position specifically to hit the board after 4 moves. So if white wants to avoid this entirely, I mean, I know a lot of players play e4. I know a lot of players who just play e4 on move 2 as well, or knight f3 or something somewhere, and they withhold this knight c3 move. All right. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thanks again to Hukin, and I look forward to hearing your comments, especially if you happen to think about the move rook g1 in that position. All right. Later, guys.